Hi, good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Vivian Guevara, Training and Technical Assistance Program Coordinator at Housing Action Illinois. I hope everyone was able to log in with any sort of complications. Can you please raise your hand and let me know if you are listening well? If you can hear me? Okay, I see the hands here. Thank you. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and it will be available for download in our website later on. For now, please download the handouts that you have in the control panel, our Fair Housing Law Summary Chart, and the Fair Housing Flyer for condos in English and Spanish. Just click on Document Name to download. If you have any questions, please write your question in the window and I will be sure that our panelists answer it during the presentation. Today's panelist is Jessica Schneider, who currently serves as a staff attorney in the Educational Equity and Fair Housing Projects of the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. This webinar will be discussing fair housing laws, legal rights and responsibilities for housing seekers and housing providers, and resources for filing complaints for fair housing violations. I want to thank our partners, Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and Access Living. This webinar series is made possible in part through Illinois Attorney General National Mortgage Foreclosure Settlement Funds. Jessica. Jessica, you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, yes, started.
Great. Thank you so much, Vivian, and I'm happy to be here with everybody to do this webinar and share some information specifically about housing counselors and their role in identifying and reporting possible housing discrimination. Housing counselors, such as yourselves, play a very important role in eliminating housing discrimination, and so we are happy to be here to share some of the information you need, as well as some of the tools and strategies for identifying housing discrimination. So thanks for joining us, and the idea is that this will be short but informative. And like Vivian said, if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat box and she will pass them on to me. So first, I just wanted to talk briefly. This is done in partnership with the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, and just give you a little bit of information about our organizations. CAFA, or the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, is a consortium of fair housing and advocacy organizations, government agencies, community-based organizations, municipalities, and planning entities, and they're all committed to the value of fair housing, diversity, and integration. And the Chicago Lawyers Committee is a member of CAFA, and specifically our Fair Housing Project. And so we provide education, outreach, and individualized technical assistance, as well as CAFA doing that to member agencies. But we are basically a public interest consortium of law firms. We are a civil rights organization. We have other projects in educational equity, voting rights, providing transactional legal assistance, employment discrimination. So we pretty much address all the traditional issues of poverty and discrimination in many ways, and we do litigation and fair housing enforcement, but we also value training and providing resources to municipalities and other agencies such as yourselves. So we are here to do all of those things with you and to try and combat the poverty and segregation that exists in our area. So what are we going to talk about today? Very briefly, what is housing discrimination? What is fair housing? What laws exists. There may be more than you think. And then identifying and reporting, what can you do if you think you or someone you serve has been a victim of housing discrimination. So we're going to focus on the role of housing counselors specifically. This is not meant to be exhaustive. It's not meant to cover every legal situation, but it's meant to provide you with kind of a snapshot so you can identify what you need to know. I know this is a pretty knowledgeable group. I reviewed the information you filled out in the survey, so I'm going to try to address some of those specific questions you had, and then also to maybe do a little bit of advanced knowledge since a lot of you know the basics already. There are also some questions around HUD-funded agencies and what their role should be, so I will address that as well. There were a few questions in the survey about how vouchers work specifically. That is not my specialty. I don't deal with the actual administration of the vouchers, but I'm happy to cover what I know. So just wanted to let you guys know that I did review that information, so I'm trying to tailor this a little bit to what you want to know and what you want to talk about. So in the survey, for the most common fair housing issues your clients face, these are some of the issues I pulled out. It's not all of them. And I like this graphic here because I think it shows that all of these kind of overlap with each other when you're talking about someone who may be low income, maybe in poverty, or even if they're not, who's facing some of these issues. Family size and finding, appropriate housing, especially for larger families, is an issue. Race and race discrimination. Income level, and then also source of income, how someone pays for their housing and whether they are discriminated against based on that. Accessible housing for people with disabilities is a huge one, as well as other issues for people with disabilities once they have access to housing. And then just in general, lack of affordable housing, which isn't necessarily a fair housing issue per se, but is definitely part of what we're talking about in terms of the larger landscape of what housing is available. There are a couple other things that we will cover. Advertising was one, where you can get assistance with fair housing complaints, and sexual harassment and how that can be a fair housing issue. So fair housing laws and requirements, it's also good to know, is one of the competency areas now for the National Certification Exam for Housing Counselors. And so this is one of the ways that you can get information and training on what housing counselors need to know, what are the basics about fair housing discrimination. So what is housing discrimination? And probably a lesser known term is fair housing. I'm going to give a little background on fair housing, where it came from, what that means, and then also what specifically is prohibited by fair housing laws. And we'll also talk about why do we need them. I'm sure a lot of people here know the answer to that, but I definitely think that it's good to go back and kind of discuss both the historical aspect of fair housing laws and where they came from and why they're so necessary today. So this is a video. It's not going to play through the webinar sound, unfortunately. I will use it for a lot of our in-person trainings, but I encourage everyone to check it out, and we can put it on the website afterwards. It's called Drawing Discrimination, and it's actually a PSA, a public service announcement put out by HUD. The other reason I like to use these is just to let you know that these resources are available. There are videos that are meant to kind of be for TV commercials. There are radio announcements, and there are print resources, and all of these are available for for your use to educate people in your community. They're just available on the websites. And so in addition to some of the materials CAFA can provide you or the Chicago Lawyers Committee can provide you, it's just good to know that those things are out there. And a lot of times videos can be a more effective way to educate people and kind of grab their attention. So HUD is one of the agencies charged with enforcing the Fair Housing Act, and so they put a lot of resources out there. So what is fair housing? A lot of you said you had pretty good knowledge of what this is and what it means. But fair housing is a right for all people to live where they choose and have access to housing, and also to enjoy the full use of their homes. So basically, you should be able to live where you would like to live. You should be able to have access to the housing in that area. And then once you're in that housing, you should be able to enjoy the full use of it just like anyone else would. So what is something that can, that would prevent that from happening for you? Unlawful discrimination, interference, coercion, threats, or intimidation by owners, landlords, real estate agents, or really any other person. Um, There are some people who might never encounter discrimination, and then there's some that might encounter it very often, and so it becomes commonplace. But I think a basic thing that everyone can understand is how housing is really central to your life, to your employment, to what you do, to where you go to school. And so this is one of the most basic rights that we have in terms of the rights that we need to protect for people. And why do we need fair housing law? So there are many examples, but a classic one to use, which you may be familiar with, is the Chicago metropolitan area being one of the most segregated in the nation. We always hover somewhere in the top 5. And as I hope you can see in this map, which is a good way to demonstrate segregation, that there are clear clusters here by race and ethnicity, depending on where in the city and where in the greater 7-county region actually you are looking at. This map was developed by CAFA, and it's one of the things that CAFA does that's an important function, is putting out reports and putting out maps, putting out tools so that you can show where segregation is and show why there's a need for fair housing. And they compared the demographic census data from the 7-county region from 1980 to 2010. So this is a map for 2010, but if I showed you the map for 1980, unfortunately it would look pretty much almost identical. These patterns of racial segregation in the greater Chicago area are so entrenched, and they haven't changed much, even though you can definitely say over the past 20 years that, the makeup, the demographics of the region have changed. The most isolated populations, according to this data, are the white and black populations. So you can kind of see the orange is the Hispanic, the pink dots are the white, the green's the Asian, and then the light blue is the black population. So 1 out of 10 white residents in the 7-county region are living in a municipality that is over 90% white, even though whites make up only 58% of the actual regional population. So 1 out of 10 are living somewhere where over 90% of the population is white, even though whites make up only 58% of the regional population. So you can see that when you're not living in areas that expose you to different people, to different things, to different cultural experiences, that's going to affect the experiences that shape your view towards housing and towards all the experiences in your life. Similarly, approximately 1 out of 12 black residents live in a municipality that is over 90% black, and black residents make only 16% of the regional population. So this is holding us back, and why? It leads to vastly different experiences for people who live in either predominantly white communities, where there's a lot of opportunities, place-based opportunities we like to call them, because they're tied to those neighborhoods, and those living in predominantly African American and Latino communities that have been isolated and had a lot of disinvestment. So this was part of the inspiration, you would say, or the reasons for the Fair Housing Act that were passed. And I'd just like to talk about the impact of segregation. It is one, that you're living in disinvested communities, that you're not exposed to people different than yourself, but it also can have all these other kind of spiraling effects. Higher crime rates, declining home equity, substandard schools because they're being disinvested in, or maybe they're getting less money per pupil depending on the funding system, higher unemployment, inadequate transportation, just all those things come together to create the life experience of someone. And so this is why really segregation in and of itself matters because it is not a good thing, but also the impact is wide-reaching. And it's a lot more just about where people live. You know, the white population, as I'm sure many of you know, is declining, and the Chicago and Cook County population is declining. So what does that mean for our future? What are we looking at in terms of development and opportunity is something to keep in mind. So the Fair Housing Act, some of you might know it was passed at a pretty tumultuous time in American history. It was on April 11th, 1968. It was a long, kind of difficult journey to get that passed. From 1966 to 67, Congress was regularly considering a fair housing bill, but could never get enough support for it. And the catalyst for getting the support for his passage really was the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1968. And that's kind of how President Johnson, you know, used this event, used the housing marches in Chicago, the segregation, the legacy of Dr. King to get this passed. And it's important to know that the government at that time was also playing a role in the segregation, redlining, blockbusting, controlling who had access to what housing. So, you know, it wasn't just that this sort of happened by accident, but it was a deliberately built system to keep certain people out of certain housing. And really at its time, the Fair Housing Act was seen as a very powerful act. I would say today it seems under-enforced. It seems despite all the power available to it, it has not done a lot to break down these barriers of segregation, and so we're really looking to see how we can better enforce it, and that's something that you all can play a role in identifying housing discrimination. So a lot of people are familiar with the Fair Housing Act. That is kind of the most widely known fair housing law. It is a federal law, so it covers the entire country. But Illinois has some pretty strong laws as well. The Illinois Human Rights Act, and there are a couple local fair housing ordinances, both at Cook County and at the Chicago level. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're thinking about fair housing violations. The Fair Housing Act actually, as you see there, has the least number of protected classes: race, color, religion, sex, familial status, national origin, or disability. And I'll note that actually disability and familial status were not included in the 1968 Act. They were added about 20 years later in an amendment. So that's interesting to note that now we see disability as being one of the most widely violated categories. And so it's interesting to note that that was not a part of the original act. The Illinois Human Rights Act identifies several other protected classes that you can see there. And we'll go into some of these in a little more detail so you can think about what they mean. And then the local fair housing ones at Cook County and Chicago identify a few more protected classes. So basically, as you move down to smaller levels of protection for smaller areas, you get increased number of protected classes. And so this really is a priority in a lot of these human rights ordinances and laws that are passed. There's a few more laws out there. I'm not going to go through these in this webinar because there's not time for that, but there's just a few things to be aware of when you're looking at the legal landscape when it comes to fair housing. Title VI, there's also Section 504, which relates to people with disabilities, Title II of the ADA, the Architectural Barriers Act, and then someone had a specific question on the survey about domestic violence, which doesn't always play directly into fair housing, but I wanted to mention the Illinois Safe Homes Act. That is a law that exists in Illinois, and it allows victims of domestic or sexual violence to leave their rental housing early prior to the end of their lease, so basically to break a lease, in order to protect their physical safety and emotional well-being. There are also certain circumstances under that act where you can have an emergency lock change if you need to keep your abuser out. There is proof required. You know, they can't just disappear and break their lease, but they need to tell the landlord or an agent of the landlord that there's what we call a credible imminent threat. of future domestic violence or sexual violence. And in that case, they can provide that information within 3 days, either before or after leaving the apartment. It has to be somewhere on the premises, but it could be, the laundry room, the backyard, the hallways, the parking lot. It doesn't need to be just in your unit. An example of something that's, credible and imminent could be you see your stalker, your abuser standing across the street from your housing. They maybe have come to your place of work, and you think next they'll come to your home. Things like that. So it needs to be something that is an actual imminent threat. So I just want to mention that as another protection that's available that relates to housing, even though it's not an actual fair housing protection. So we won't go through this in great detail, but just to spell out in a little more what the actual protected classes are, and then also what deadlines there are to file, because this can get a little confusing, especially if you're trying to give someone information about where they can file a fair housing complaint. The federal, as we went through before, has the least protected classes. You move on to some more at the state level, and there is an order of protection status that is only at the Illinois level. That was not so new anymore. It was passed in 2010, but it's good to note that if you have an order of protection against someone, that can't be a reason not to rent to them. When you go to the county and the city, the big thing we're talking about is source of income. And I know this is probably an issue for a lot of your clients. Maybe they have a housing voucher, maybe they have some other source of income that the landlord or his or her agent doesn't want to accept. So that is now protected at the county. It was just added in 2013, and that was a big campaign that Chicago Lawyers Committee, as well as several other agencies, including CAFA, were involved in adding in that campaign to add it to the Cook County Fair Housing Ordinance. Previously, it had the source of income provision, but it specifically excluded vouchers. The city has had that protection for a long time, that you cannot refuse to rent to someone just because they have a voucher. However, as you know and I know, it is widely violated all the time. We have constant intakes here at our office from people that say that once they say they have a voucher, the landlord says, oh, we can't do that. Oh, I don't think the owner wants that. Oh, I'm not sure. We're not approved for that, as well as many other sometimes just a straight out statement saying they don't take them. And so there needs to be a big effort around education around that issue, but people also need to know they can report it. So I would encourage you to tell your clients, if there is someone who is refused to rent to them because of their voucher, to contact us or another fair housing agency. One more thing to note, at the city level, there's a brand new protection of March of this year, which is military status. A person can now claim military status if they're on active duty or in the reserves, and it also extends to veterans, as well as military discharge status. So you'll notice that the state lists military discharge status specifically, but the protection at the city level is a little bit broader. So there will be, a lot of things that can fall under that category. So it's important to keep in mind. For deadlines, all you need to know, there are agencies that enforce these laws and there are courts that enforce them. The agencies are HUD, IDHR, and then there's an agency at the city level and the county level. Those complaint processes are a little different. The most important thing to keep in mind is if you have a source of income complaint, your only option is to file at the city commission. We would love to see it as part of the federal law, the state law someday, but that is not currently the case. And so you only have 180 days. That's 6 months. So you want to make sure that you're encouraging people to report that right away, because those 6 months go by really quickly. These are some of the specific things that are illegal under fair housing laws. So we covered protected classes, so you have to be a member of one of those protected classes, and then that has to be the reason that the person is committing one of these acts that are prohibited. Most commonly people think of refusing to rent, but there can also be different terms and conditions. Maybe you require more earnest money to be put up for a sale for an African American family, which is in case we actually had, instead of for a white family or a white couple. Maybe someone calls and the unit's not available, but then suddenly it is available to someone else. Steering can be very common, and it can take place from neighborhood to neighborhood, but also even in a building. Some of these larger buildings that have a lot of different floors with a lot of different pricing, you can say you'd be more comfortable on these lower floors. I don't think you should try to rent some of these higher floors, and trying to keep, especially voucher holders, if you do have them in the building on certain floors, that can be steering. We talked about refusing to consider income, and then harassment and intimidation. That is part of fair housing law, and it can extend to neighbors, it can extend to maintenance staff, it can extend really to anyone. The fair housing law is very broad, at least in the Fair Housing Act, in that it extends to any other persons. So really it can be anyone on your property that's interfering. Another common scenario can be if you decide to file a complaint and then you are retaliated against. Maybe the landlord stops doing repairs in your apartment. Maybe they give you a hard time about paying the rent. A lot of these things are part of fair housing, and you need to separate out whether it is actually a fair housing violation or if it's just the landlord, kind of being a jerk, for a lack of a better word, which also happens. A few more things. There's going to be, the next webinar will be specifically about disability, so I'm not going to go into that in too much detail here, because you'll get a whole presentation on that, and it really is an area that deserves its own presentation, because there are a lot of different things that relate to housing for people with disabilities. But the main things to keep in mind are housing modifications and reasonable accommodations. And if you're not familiar with these terms, the easier way to remember it is that a modification is actually some sort of physical change to the unit. Maybe the doorway needs to be widened, maybe they need access, and that would usually be at the cost of the renter. There are some limited funds available, but the landlord is not expected to pay for those changes. Going forward, for newer buildings, the law is different, so this mostly applies to older buildings, and there is a lot of older housing stock in the Chicago area. An accommodation is just an adjustment to a policy. Maybe someone has a service animal and it's a no pets building. Maybe somebody needs to pay rent on a different day because of their disability. They have a third party who helps pay their rent, and that's how they have it arranged. Maybe they need to get communications through email or orally because they have some sort of impairment, things like that. So it's just good to know that you can request an accommodation. It does not mean the landlord has to automatically grant it, but they have to engage in that process with you. They have to say, well, this isn't reasonable because, or something like that. And it's good for landlords to have a policy that can usually protect them, where they can say, you need to fill out this form, you need to give me documentation. They can provide documentation or ask for documentation of the disability, but they can't ask for anything they want. And effective communication is also an issue. As we just mentioned, you might need some different form of communication, whether it be Braille, whether it be enhanced audio, things like that. So you can't just refuse to engage with someone because they have a disability. And the other one that we also had just mentioned was harassment. So either harassing them because they're a certain color, or a certain religion, or something like that, or retaliation because they filed a complaint. So these are the different things to keep in mind, especially when you're thinking about clients with disabilities. So just remember that the protected class and the prohibited act together equal a fair housing violation. If you have a protected class, but it's not something that's prohibited, you don't have a fair housing violation. If, someone refused to give a loan or give a rent to someone because they're white, that's not a protected class. So you need to put both those pieces together, and then you can have a possible fair housing violation. The good news about the agencies is that they can do an investigation. So maybe someone's not sure, but they really have this feeling that they were treated differently because of their protected class. The agency can do some investigation, can interview the different parties, and then can basically provide that evidence. So it's a good way to kind of see if you're unsure, and to have the agency do that for you. Obviously, if you're filing in court, then you need to keep in mind that you will be doing that yourself. So we're just going to throw out a hypothetical. I'm going to go through it, and then if people have questions or comments or thoughts, there are no wrong answers, so feel free to put them in the chat box. So you can see this on your screen. James saw an apartment advertised. He left several phone messages for the landlord and never got a call back. His friend Joseph, who is white and he's African American, left one message. He immediately got a call back and was invited to view the apartment. So do we think this is a fair housing violation or not a fair housing violation? And I'll just give you maybe 1 or 2 minutes in case anyone wants to go ahead and type something in there.
Jessica, the majority say that, yeah, it sounds like a violation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vivian. Um, so let's talk about that for a minute. So the majority think it's a fair housing violation. That is usually what we get when we use this hypo. I will say that there are a couple of things to consider. One is that, there can be some question as to whether you can identify someone's race or racial background by their voice, and whether that was just an issue of the landlord being lazy and not calling someone back, or if they actually think that it was because of their race and he could clearly tell from the voicemail. So this is a good example of fair housing testing, which is investigation that our agency also does. Where we can investigate this, we have trained volunteers. We can have them call, we can have someone of a different racial background call, and then see if we have evidence to support what seems like a violation. A couple other things, this is someone who actually initiated that testing process themselves, which we do actually see sometimes, that people will go ahead and have their friend call and see, but it's also good to just contact a fair housing agency for some investigation. There's also that he left several phone messages, so maybe one message wouldn't have been too convincing, but since it was several phone messages and then someone else got a call back right away, that could be indication that it was because of his race. So these are things to consider when you're looking at, we consider when looking at a scenario. And just to give you some idea of what we see today, it can be a lot more subtle than it has been historically, but it also can be sometimes more blatant. So this is another situation where it might not be necessarily clear. Carla is the leasing agent for a large apartment building. She doesn't accept applications from non-English speaking applicants because she knows she can't communicate with them and they can't read the rules in English. So is there a violation, do you think, on this? And I'll give you a minute, and then Vivian, if you're able to just tell me like you did before, that works great.
Sure, let's see what the attendees say. Yes, again, the majority say yes, this is a violation.
Okay, majority say it's a violation, which is interesting because one issue we have here is that, as you might have seen, if we're looking at immigration status or non-English speaking groups of people, that is not technically a protected class. However, what you're probably kind of latching onto here is that there could be a tie to national origin when you're talking about non-English speakers. There could also be a tie to perhaps race or color, depending on who you're talking about. And the fact that she will not engage with them at all because she thinks they can't read the rules could be a violation. However, it is a little bit tricky because you need to think about what the protected class would be. Obviously, she's subjecting them to different terms and conditions and refusing to rent to them. Maybe they came with someone who could speak English and she still wouldn't engage with them, which could be other evidence on your side. So it would just, have to be an analysis of who exactly was coming and if they had anything in common besides their non-English speaking. And this is just an example of how sometimes you need to do a little work. Maybe it's not quite clear to get to the violation because fair housing laws haven't caught up with things like immigration status or English speaking ability, but it's good to keep in mind that you can try to tie that to something that is a violation. So thanks everyone for your participation. So it's good to work with scenarios because then you get to apply the law, which is more effective than me actually telling you what it is. I want to just talk briefly about source of income. It is a very hot topic, as I mentioned before. It came up in the survey that you all filled out because it is a huge problem for a lot of people trying to rent with vouchers. And not just vouchers are protected, but that is the most common thing that we see. So under Chicago and Cook County, again, just to review, you can't refuse to rent or otherwise discriminate against someone because of their source of income. And that's any lawful manner by which you support yourself, whether it be disability, whether it be, things of that nature. One of the more common things we see is not an outright denial, but issues participating with the whole process that you have to go through when you're renting with a voucher. Not wanting to fill out the paperwork. We had an intake recently where the property management company had changed. There was a tenant who had been living in that building for quite some time, a few years, but the new property management said, I don't know how to deal with this. I don't think the new owner wants to deal with this, and I don't know if we can renew your lease. Well, we contacted them and said, you need to deal with this. You need to fill out this paperwork. And it can be difficult paperwork. CHA does a background check on the new landlord, the new property management, and they need to fill out things. They need to provide access to their checking or whatever account they use for direct deposit. So there are things you have to do, and we're not saying the CHA is always the easiest entity to deal with or the voucher program, but you can't just refuse. And then you get into those gray areas of maybe they don't show up for the inspection, maybe it has to be scheduled several times. And a lot of voucher holders have a very finite period of time in which they can move. And so that can really affect them in their ability to find housing in what we usually call opportunity areas, areas that have better access to employment, to transit, to schools. if you can't break into those areas, you're not going to be able to have that option to live there. So just source of income is very important, and please encourage people to report it. They can report it directly to the commission. They can contact a fair housing agency, but it's very important that we educate landlords. A lot of them don't know that this is against the fair housing ordinance. So we just talked about this a little bit, different treatment. Advertising is an important one, where you express specifically in your advertisement, whether it be on Craigslist or wherever it might be, no Section 8, right, or no housing choice vouchers. Occasionally you do get people who say they want Section 8 voucher holders. Some landlords think it's, the best way to kind of have people in their building and making sure the rent are paid. But more commonly we see the no Section 8, or we see different treatment, or we see a refusal outright to rent. And then we talked about those administrative requirements, which if they refuse to cooperate can be an issue. Lesser known instances of discrimination, I just want to make sure we cover. Familial status isn't widely known as a violation, but if you do have children under the age of 18, or you're expecting children, or you're even in the process of adopting or acquiring children another way, that's a protected class. And so if you're steered to another building, if you're told this is not an appropriate apartment for a family of that size, that can get a little tricky because you have to look at occupancy requirements, but those can be fair housing violations. Other things we've seen are your kids can't be outside playing at this time, they're too loud. There's a lot of senior tenants here. Well, are those restrictions something that makes sense, or are they just discriminating against people with children? Sexual harassment. Harassment includes sexual harassment or harassment based on sex. It can be a fair housing violation. Obviously, it could be another violation or a criminal violation, but keep in mind that it can be a fair housing violation, and you can file a complaint. So if maintenance staff is forcing you to engage in certain sexual acts in exchange for maintenance, that unfortunately is something we've seen before. If someone in your building or your neighbor is harassing you, sending you text messages, we've seen that before. And there have been some bigger cases in buildings where around the country where this was occurring in a pretty wide scale. So unfortunately it happens, and like most other fair housing violations, it's important to report it. Sexual orientation, that's only protected in Illinois, but you'll see that we had a case where a man who was living in a building who was gay, his landlord put up signs and using slurs against him, literally printed out signs and put them in the hallways, and which obviously encouraged other people to speak their mind about that as well. We got a fairly large damage award for that case. Other things, refusing to rent to an all-female couple, an all-male couple, refusing to rent a one-bedroom. Certain places you might not see it, and other places you might see it a lot. Advertising is something that a few of you wanted to know more about. If you make or place an advertisement that has a preference that can be discriminatory, that can be a violation. We at the Chicago Lawyers Committee will traditionally look through advertisements, encourage people to tell us about advertisements that might say no Section 8, no children, or things like that that can be a preference. One kind of exception that exists is for roommates. Usually it has been held in some places in the country that you can express a gender preference for a roommate. And a lot of these cases people think, oh, I need to consider everyone, and that means I need to be open to renting to anyone. Well, you need to consider anyone. Obviously, at that point, if you've considered everyone equally and you have a preference, that's fine, but you can't state that preference in the advertisement. And it can also be a liability for who's ever placing the advertisement. The issue becomes with things like Craigslist have been ruled not to have any liability and to only be responsible for providing a forum for people to present that. And order of protection we talked about, just a good one to mention because it's in Illinois. So here's an example of an ad, apartment for rent, couple preferred, 2-bedroom, 2-bath. You see the rent, you see the text there. So this could be an example of something that we see that's subtle if you really look for it. I'm going to try to use this pen feature to point out a couple things. You know, couple preferred, that could be saying that they don't want children. Second bedroom makes a great office. That could be an issue. And it also quiet. Some people, when I do this hypo, mention 10-floor building as being possibly discouraging people with disabilities. We obviously don't know. Also the use of walking distance. Now, we don't know whether, you know, hopefully the building has an elevator or not. So these are kind of some examples of the more subtle things you might see in an ad, and if we saw this, we might consider filing a complaint or just contacting who's ever placing the ad to educate them about the fact that they have a preference stated here, even if it's subtle. And I'm going to erase that. Okay, and then just toward the end, and so we'll have a couple minutes for questions. In terms of identifying and reporting housing discrimination, how do you do that? So one thing specific to housing counselors is that, you know, in order to be certified now, the organizations must introduce and update counselors with Federal Fair Housing Act and local fair housing laws. And this is just something I pulled from the Fair Housing Counselors or the HUDhousingcounselors.com training site. You know, there is a responsibility when you're engaging in housing counseling to understand the Fair Housing Act and to recognize those signs and evidence of potential housing discrimination. And it's also very important to just promote awareness. A lot of people don't know there are these fair housing laws and that they can file complaints, you know, through HUD or through some other program. The other thing to keep in mind, and there is going to be a separate webinar on this as well, which is why I'm not covering it in detail. Fair housing is not just enforcement, but also there's this other part of the Fair Housing Act called affirmatively furthering fair housing. And that means if you're getting federal funding, taking proactive steps to promote integration, to make sure that your policies are not implicating fair housing violations. And so a lot of fair housing and a lot of really discrimination and civil rights work is moving a little more away from enforcement when the violation has already happened and there's things you can do but only so much you can do, to how do we be proactive, how do we encourage people to be actively promoting fair housing. And so once you have the basic knowledge of giving someone information on how to file a complaint or what might be a fair housing violation, then you can move more towards what are some steps, what are some encouraging things we can do in terms of promoting integration, encouraging people to think about different neighborhoods, encouraging practices that will break down some barriers of fair housing. So it's important to know how you file a complaint. I referred to this briefly, but some things are just landlord-tenant violations, and they could very well be a violation of landlord-tenant laws. You know, Chicago itself has a pretty strong residential landlord-tenant ordinance, but it's important to separate that from fair housing laws. There are very few exemptions. I didn't mention them specifically because there really are very few, and the Chicago Fair Housing Ordinance actually doesn't have any. But you may have heard of this as an owner-occupied certain number of units, 4 or less, then you can be exempt from fair housing laws, but it has to be the landlord has to reside on the property. Who has jurisdiction? Is this in Cook County? Is this in Chicago? You know, what agency would be appropriate? And these are all things that the Chicago Lawyers Committee or another agency, which I'll put them all up on a slide in a second, can help you with. So don't feel that you need to make all these determinations yourself. But your clients could also contact HUD, the Illinois Department of Human Rights, or one of these commissions directly to file. You don't need an attorney. We often encourage people to have an attorney because we think the outcome might be better and we can help guide them through the process, but you can make a complaint without an attorney. If you take a matter to court, obviously it's in your best interest to have an attorney. And we have cases that we file in all these places. If you're at an agency, after you file, there is investigation. They determine whether they think there's substantial evidence to support the complaint, and if there is, you move forward to a hearing. If not, you dismiss it. There's also conciliation attempts, which means, can we sit down and work this out? Is there something we can do to settle this matter that would, end it right here? And I think it's important to remember, and it's important to tell people, damages are available, monetary damages for emotional distress, which can be hard to measure with discrimination, but there are, standards out there, other cases you can compare it to. The agencies can fine these actors as well. There can be punitive damages available, which means that you did this in a knowing manner and you knew you were discriminating. And as a civil rights organization, and a lot of fair housing agencies are the same, we also think about relief in the public interest. What about the next person who is doing this? And so we want them to get fair housing training. We want them to display notices of fair housing rights. And we want them to do things like that as well. So you can get creative in terms of what you're asking an agency to do. Sometimes you have a situation where you can try and get someone the unit if it hasn't been rented yet, and that would require some injunctive relief as well. So the main thing I want you to take away is you can file a complaint and there are fairly substantial remedies available. These are other fair housing enforcement agencies. There's a lot in the greater Chicago area, which is unique, so it's something that you can take advantage of. You'll be hearing from Access Living. They focus on disability, and these are some other ones that are in the suburbs and the city area. And CAFA can be a resource if you're not sure where to go, if you're not sure what you need. You can reach out to Patricia Fran. We basically just want to have these conversations, because the more we do that, the more we can work together for housing discrimination elimination. CAFA can also provide technical assistance. We can provide for housing training like this one or different ones, and we can provide data assistance, referral relationships, implementing best practices, community engagement. Through this grant, we are able to provide a lot of technical assistance, so we are able to help you. And that is it. We thank you for joining us. Again, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I thank everyone for being with us today. And there's our contact information too if you need it.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, please, we have the copy of the presentation. Yeah, we are going to download the presentation and the recorded into our website. Don't forget to download the handouts that are in your control panel, the Fair Housing Laws Summary Chart, the condo flyer in English and in Spanish. And I'm going to remind you that our next Fair Housing webinar will be on July 12th, and I will send you the invitation soon this week. Our panelists will be discussing fair housing rights for people with disabilities. So I hope you can join us as well. Thank you so much, Jessica. I don't think so we have any other questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, Jessica.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I have just one question here.
Mm-hmm.
So if a woman has an ad for roommate and says that she prefers female roommate.
So if a woman, I think if I understand the question, is if a woman is renting, if advertising for a roommate and wants a similar gendered roommate, that So,
It is
and some,
discrimination.
is that discrimination? Technically it is. There's a case in the Ninth Circuit that about this website called roommates.com that came out the other way. So I don't think that that's going to be something that fair housing agencies will really pursue. It's kind of seen as people can make preferences for their own gender. So, but technically there was no exception put in for roommates in advertising, but that's kind of the way the law is going.
Thank you. There is another question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. No. Well, if you later on remember or you have another question, you have the contact information, email address of Jessica and Patricia from as well. And again, we're going to see it on July 12th in our next Fair Housing webinar, Fair Housing Rights for People with Disabilities. Thank you so much and have a good day.